In the back room of a Philadelphia photography shop, a dealer kept a wooden box of daguerreotype plates he refused to sell. 41 of them. Each one showed a different customer, a different sitting, a different year, and in the deep background of every single plate, the same building. A structure no one in the city could identify. He never explained why he kept them. He never explained why he stopped selling that particular camera. And in 1874, 3 years before he died, he burned his entire ledger of customer names. Everyone but the 41. That's where this story starts. Not with the building, with the box. The shop itself was nothing remarkable. A narrow storefront wedged between a milliner and a hardware dealer, the kind of place that survived on turnover, buying up cameras and darkroom equipment from bankrupt studios, from estates, from families clearing out a dead relative's belongings, then reselling them to whoever walked through the door needing a portrait made cheaply. By the 1860s, daguerreotypes were already considered old-fashioned. Faster, cheaper processes using paper and glass had taken over the trade. But there was still a market for used equipment, and this dealer specialized in it. He didn't manufacture anything. He didn't grind lenses or build cameras. He bought low, sold low, and kept meticulous records of where every piece of his stock had come from, a habit that would matter enormously later, though he had no way of knowing that yet. Somewhere in that resale chain, a small number of his cameras started producing plates that customers swore they couldn't explain. The first account anyone can reliably reconstruct involves a soldier's family sitting for a portrait before he shipped out. A wife, 2 children, the soldier himself in his best coat, arranged in front of a plain studio backdrop, the kind of neutral wall every portrait studio in the country used by the thousand. The sitting took just under a minute, the family holding as still as they could while the plate exposed. When it developed, the backdrop wasn't there. In its place stood a building, tall, ornate, covered in stonework far too elaborate for anything in that studio or that city or, arguably, that century. The photographer apologized, assumed a flaw in the plate, and offered to reshoot at no charge. The family declined. They kept the flawed print. Family lore holds that the wife thought it looked like a cathedral from a country none of them had ever visited, and she wanted it precisely because it was strange. At first, the dealer assumed it was exactly what the photographer assumed: a flaw in the silver coating. Daguerreotype plates were notoriously unstable. A bad batch of chemicals, a scratch in the emulsion, uneven mercury vapor during development, and you'd get ghosting, doubling, strange bleaching where the image hadn't set correctly. He'd seen customers bring back defective plates before. This looked, on the surface, like one more, except the defect kept repeating. Not randomly, consistently. A bride photographed in a different studio, 2 cities away, produced the same architecture in the same relative position in the frame, replacing a painted garden backdrop that should have been there instead. She later told the studio's owner that in the moment the plate was handed to her, still faintly warm from the mercury bath, she genuinely believed for a few seconds that the exposure had captured a window behind her that had somehow been bricked over and forgotten, until she remembered there had never been a window there at all, only a curtain and a wall. A pair of business partners, sitting for a formal portrait to commemorate a new partnership, got the building rising behind them, where a bookshelf had been carefully arranged for the shot, every carved cornice and archway rendered in more detail than the furniture actually in the room. Different sitters, different rooms, different cities eventually, as the cameras changed hands and traveled with the ordinary churn of a second-hand market, and every time the same proportions, the same impossible level of architectural detail for something that was supposedly nothing more than a flaw in the coating. He started keeping the plates people brought back instead of simply refunding them. That alone was unusual. A dealer in used equipment survives on turnover, not on stockpiling merchandise nobody wants. But he kept every one. He wrote a date on the back of each plate and a name, the customer, the sitting, sometimes the studio where the photograph had been taken. By the time historians found the box more than a century later, that handwriting was the only surviving record of who these 41 people had even been. Here's what you need to understand about how a daguerreotype actually works, because it matters for everything that follows. Unlike the film photography that came later, a daguerreotype isn't a negative. It's a direct positive, formed on a silver-coated copper plate that's been sensitized with iodine vapor, exposed inside the camera, and then developed over hot mercury vapor, a process invented by Louis Daguerre and made public in 1839. Every plate is one of a kind. There's no negative to reprint from, no way to duplicate the image except by rephotographing the physical object itself. If something appears on that plate, it was captured in that single, unrepeatable exposure. It isn't a copy of a copy. It's the only copy that will ever exist, and once the mercury sets the image, nothing about it can be layered, edited, or altered without physically damaging the plate. And exposures in this era were long. Not the fraction of a second you'd get from a modern camera, often 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute or more, depending on the light and the specific chemistry of the plate. That's long enough for anything moving through the frame to blur into a translucent smear or vanish from the image entirely if it moved fast enough. It's a real, well-documented optical fact of the period, and it explains a great deal of what looked like ghosts in 19th-century photography generally. A person walking briskly through a busy street scene, captured across a full minute of exposure, simply wouldn't register at all. The street would look empty. The moving world erased itself from the plate, and only the stationary world remained behind. Which raises the obvious question the dealer's customers kept asking him, one sitting at a time. If a moving object disappears from a long exposure, what does it take for a stationary object, a building standing in a fixed spot, to appear in a photograph of a room where no building stood at all? He didn't have an answer. For years, neither did anyone else who handled the plates. Later researchers, trying to find any physical explanation before reaching for anything stranger, looked hard at the optics themselves. 19th-century lenses, hand-ground the way this workshops were, could carry genuine flaws, internal strain in the glass, tiny bubbles trapped during cooling, imperfect curvature at the edges, and any of those flaws can, under the right lighting, throw a faint secondary image onto the plate alongside the primary one. It's a real phenomenon, well documented in the history of optics, and for a while, it looked like the simplest possible answer. Atmospheric science offers something similar on a larger scale. A mirage, in the true optical sense, isn't a hallucination at all, but a real image, bent into view by layers of air at different temperatures and densities. The same principle behind a fata morgana, where distant coastlines and structures can appear to hang in the sky above the horizon, inverted and displaced from where they actually stand. Both explanations share the same appeal. They don't require anything supernatural. They just require light behaving in a way that's unusual, but physically ordinary. Neither one survives contact with the actual pattern, though. A lens flaw would repeat every time that specific lens was used, and these plates came from dozens of different lenses, ground by the same hand, but never repeating the flaw twice in any single one of them. A mirage requires very specific atmospheric conditions that don't exist inside a studio, behind drawn curtains, under artificial light. Both are the kind of answer you reach for because they're comfortable. Neither one actually fits what's sitting in the box. The pattern held for roughly a decade before it drew real attention outside his shop, and by the time it did, it landed in the middle of a culture that was primed to take it seriously. The 1860s and 1870s were the height of what's now called the spirit photography craze, a genuine, well-documented phenomenon in which photographers across the country claimed their plates were capturing the deceased, hovering behind grieving sitters who'd come in for an ordinary portrait. Entire businesses were built on it. Grieving families, still raw from a war that had killed hundreds of thousands of young men, paid handsomely for a single translucent figure standing behind a mother or a widow in an otherwise unremarkable print. Spiritualist societies held seances in parlors across the country, and photography, new, mechanical, seemingly incapable of lying the way a medium's hand could lie, was treated by many as the one tool capable of finally proving what a seance alone could only suggest. A camera, people reasoned, doesn't have an imagination. If something showed up on the plate, something had to have been there to make the light behave that way. That single assumption, more than any specific photographer's trick, is what let the spirit photography trade thrive for as long as it did. And it's the same assumption that made the Philadelphia dealer's 41 plates so much harder to simply dismiss than an ordinary hoax would have been. The most notorious practitioner, William H. Mumler, ran a studio first in Boston and later in New York, and by 1869 he was standing trial in a New York courtroom on charges of fraud, accused of faking his so-called spirit images through deliberate double exposure, printing one negative over another to produce a ghostly second figure inside the frame. He was acquitted on a technicality, but the trial exposed the mechanics behind the trick to a public that had, until that point, largely wanted to believe. That's the world this dealer was operating in, a public primed to see meaning in a smear of silver on a copper plate, a public that had just watched, in open court, exactly how easy that kind of image was to fake, and had also just watched a jury decline to convict the man who faked it anyway. Skepticism and belief were running side by side through every parlor in the country, and a shop with 41 plates showing the same unexplained building was exactly the kind of story that could go either way, depending entirely on who was telling it. But here's the detail that separates this from an ordinary spirit photography hoax, and it's the detail that kept the dealer from simply writing the whole thing off. Mumler's fakes required a second exposure, a deliberate act, a second negative laid deliberately over the first, printed together in a dark room under controlled conditions. These plates were daguerreotypes. There was no negative to double expose in the first place. There was no darkroom trick available to a 19th-century camera that could layer one image over another on a single silvered copper plate within a single sitting. Whatever was happening, it wasn't happening the way Mumler's fraud happened. It was happening inside the camera itself, in the same 30 to 90-second window as the sitter's own portrait, on hardware that had no mechanism whatsoever for combining two separate exposures into one image. So the dealer started asking a narrower question, not, is this a hoax? He was fairly confident by then that it wasn't, at least not the kind of hoax anyone around him knew how to produce with the equipment involved. The question became, what do all 41 cameras have in common? There was another sitting, less often mentioned than the widow's, but preserved in more detail because the studio that processed it kept unusually thorough records. Two young sisters photographed together for their aging mother, holding hands in matching dresses in front of what should have been a painted lattice of climbing roses, a popular backdrop that particular studio used for children's portraits. In the developed plate, the lattice was gone. In its place, rising directly behind the girls, stood the building's upper floors, window after window, in a row too regular to be anything but deliberate architecture, and, faintly, what several people who examined the plate independently described as a shape in one of the highest windows that could have been a figure, or could just as easily have been a trick of the silver grain catching the light at a certain angle. The studio owner, uneasy, offered the mother a full refund and a free reshoot. She kept the original anyway. She told him, according to the account passed down through the family, that her daughters had slept soundly through every night of the following month, and she wasn't inclined to question good luck. There was one sitting in particular, though, that convinced the dealer himself to stop offering refunds altogether and start actually investigating. A young widow came in wanting a single portrait made of herself, alone, to send to a brother who'd moved west and had never seen her as an adult. The sitting was unremarkable. The plate was not. Behind her, in place of the studio's painted curtain, stood the building, closer this time, more detailed than any previous plate, close enough that individual carved figures were visible along what looked like a cornice or a lintel above a doorway. The widow didn't ask for a refund. She asked to buy the plate outright, at whatever price he wanted, because she said the building looked like something her late husband had once described from a dream he'd had recurring for years before he died. The dealer refused to sell it to her. That plate became the first one he deliberately kept rather than returned, and it's the plate later collectors have generally treated as the clearest of the 41. He traced the cameras after that, slowly, painstakingly, the way you'd expect from a man whose entire business was second-hand equipment and who therefore already kept meticulous records of where his own stock came from. He wrote to the studios that had processed the plates, asking where each camera had been purchased. He cross-referenced serial stampings, lens markings, the small maker's signatures ground into the glass itself that most photographers never bothered to check. And what he found, patiently assembled over roughly 2 years of correspondence, was that every single camera that had ever produced one of these plates could be traced back through 1 or 2 prior owners to a single source. A lens grinder who'd operated out of a small workshop for less than a decade before disappearing from the trade entirely, sometime around 1858. Not a famous name. Not a manufacturer anyone today would recognize. A single craftsman grinding optical glass by hand in a workshop that employed at most 2 or 3 assistants, whose lenses ended up, through the ordinary churn of a second-hand market, scattered across a dozen studios in 3 states. That wasn't the end of what he could find either. Property records from the period, cross-referenced decades later by a researcher working from the dealer's surviving papers, show the workshop occupied a single narrow lot at the edge of the city's industrial district, the kind of address that would have been unremarkable in every way except one. The lot had changed hands 4 times in the 6 years before the lens grinder took possession of it, each previous owner holding it for less than a year before selling at a loss. No fire is recorded, no flood, no structural failure, nothing in the city's building inspection ledgers to explain why a modest commercial lot would churn through 4 owners in 6 years in a city where property in that district typically held for a generation or more. The lens grinder was simply the 5th owner in a row to take a short, unexplained turn with the address, and, unlike the 4 before him, at least left something behind worth remembering him for. By the time a researcher finally located the lot in person, more than a century after the workshop closed, the original building was long gone, replaced twice over by structures that had themselves since been replaced again. The address today holds a parking structure, unremarkable in every way, with no plaque and no marker of any kind to suggest anything had ever stood there worth remembering. A city archivist who'd worked in the district for 30 years and who agreed to pull whatever records the department still held on the lot said she'd never once heard the workshop mentioned in all her time there and had no record of a lens grinder operating on that address at all beyond the single tax ledger entry the researcher had already found on his own. She checked adjoining properties on the same block on the chance the workshop's address had simply been recorded incorrectly somewhere along the way. Nothing matched. Whatever paperwork the city had once kept on the 4 owners who churned through that lot before the lens grinder and on the man himself after them hadn't survived, not lost in any specific fire or flood the records could point to, just absent, the way certain small businesses from that era simply failed to leave a trace behind at all. The trail, physically, ends at an empty parking structure with no plaque, no marker, and no living memory of what had briefly stood on it. The dealer never found the man himself, whatever paper trail he managed to reconstruct around the property. No death certificate turned up in the city's records, no estate sale, no forwarding address filed with the post office. A tradesman who ground glass for less than a decade and then simply stopped appearing in any ledger, any city directory, any customer's memory that anyone could later locate. One of the workshop's later owners told the dealer, in a letter that survives, that he'd always assumed the man had simply moved on to a more profitable trade, but couldn't say which one or where. Now, pull back for a second, Because this is where the story most people tell about these plates starts to drift somewhere the evidence doesn't actually go, and it's worth being honest about that before we go any further. The building in these 41 plates has been described by later collectors who've handled the surviving images as resembling the kind of monumental, ornate civic architecture associated with the so-called Old World mythology, the theory, popular in certain corners of alternative history, that a wave of grand 19th-century architecture was systematically erased from cities across America and Europe, its true age and origin buried, its builders written out of the historical record entirely. It's a compelling story. It's also one this channel can't verify, and neither could the dealer, and neither could anyone who's examined the plates since. What we actually have is a physical object, a badly matched piece of architecture, appearing consistently across otherwise unrelated exposures, on cameras built by one small vanished workshop. Everything past that point is interpretation, not evidence. And the honest version of this story keeps those two things separate, even when the tempting version doesn't. What we do know, because it's documented in the surviving fragment of the dealer's correspondence, is that he became consumed by it. He stopped advertising the lens grinder's cameras for sale specifically, pulled everyone he could still identify from his own inventory, apparently trying to prevent more of them from circulating at real cost to a business that survived on turnover. He wrote to at least 2 other second-hand dealers in neighboring cities asking whether they'd ever handled equipment from the same workshop and whether any of their own customers had reported anything similar. 2 letters survive. In neither of them does he ask about ghosts, and in neither does he ask about lost cities. He asks a much narrower, much stranger question: whether the other dealer's customers had ever reported the building appearing more than once from the same camera, the same sitting, because his own records showed it never had. One appearance, one plate, never twice from the same equipment, the same day, the same subject. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first. It means whatever was happening wasn't a permanent defect baked into the glass itself. A scratched or flawed lens would produce the same distortion in every exposure it took, consistently, forever, the way any damaged equipment behaves. This wasn't consistent in that way. It was consistent in a stranger way entirely. It happened once, unpredictably, scattered across dozens of different cameras built from the same small batch of hand-ground lenses, and then it simply stopped permanently in that specific camera for the rest of its working life. No camera on record ever did it twice. One of the surviving letters includes a reply from a dealer in a second city, a name that doesn't appear anywhere else in the historical record, running a shop that closed decades ago and left no other trace. He wrote back confirming that yes, he'd handled at least 6 cameras from the same workshop over the years, and that 2 of his own customers had described something similar: an architectural intrusion present in exactly 1 plate each, never repeating. He hadn't kept the plates. He'd assumed, as most dealers would, that it was simple equipment failure, refunded the customers, and moved on with the ordinary business of running a shop. It was only the Philadelphia dealer's letter, arriving years later, and asking the specific right question, that made him reconsider what he'd actually seen and dismissed at the time. His reply ends with a line the Philadelphia dealer apparently found significant enough to underline. He wished, now, that he'd kept even one of the plates because he could no longer entirely picture the building well enough to be sure it matched. By 1874, 3 years before his death, the Philadelphia dealer burned his ledger. Not the plates. He kept all 41 sealed in the wooden box that would eventually surface generations later in an estate sale. Just the ledger. The record connecting which customers had bought which cameras, which studios had processed which sittings, which names attached to which plates beyond the bare dates and initials already written on the backs. Whatever he was protecting, the customer's privacy, his own reputation as a reliable dealer in a trade built on trust, or something else entirely he never wrote down, He made a deliberate choice to destroy the connective tissue of the story while preserving every piece of physical evidence itself. If you wanted to erase a mystery, the obvious move is to burn the plates. He did the opposite. He kept the mystery intact and sealed under glass and burned only the map that led back to it. He died in 1877 at his home above the shop of causes nobody thought worth recording in detail. The box passed to a nephew who had no interest in the photography trade and, by every indication, no idea what the box actually contained or why his uncle had guarded it so carefully. It sat in an attic for decades, moved twice between family members who treated it as unremarkable clutter, before finally resurfacing in a 20th-century estate sale, where a handful of the plates were purchased individually, separately, by different collectors, none of whom initially had any reason to think their new acquisition connected to anything beyond itself. It took years of patient cross-referencing between auction records, collector notes, and the handwriting on the back of each plate before anyone realized all 41 traced back to a single source. The same box, the same dealer, the same unidentified building repeating across every single one. Modern examination hasn't resolved much, though not for lack of trying. Several of the plates have since been studied under magnification and ultraviolet light by conservators experienced in 19th-century photographic processes, the same techniques used to authenticate daguerreotypes generally, checking for tampering, for later retouching, for any sign the silver surface had been reworked after its original exposure. Nothing has turned up. The architectural detail sits in exactly the same layer of silver as the sitter's face and clothing, formed in the same mercury development, with no evidence of a second pass, a scratched-in addition, or any physical intervention after the plate came out of the camera. Whatever produced the image, it produced it the same way the rest of the portrait was produced, in one exposure, on one plate, with no seam anywhere a conservator has been able to find. And the story didn't end with the 41. In the years since researchers first connected the plates to a single source, at least 2 more have surfaced independently. The most recent turned up at a small regional auction, catalogued by house staff as an unremarkable period portrait of an elderly couple, listed with a starting bid low enough that it drew almost no attention until the sale was already underway. A collector, bidding remotely, who happened to have spent years studying the published photographs of the original box, recognized the architecture in the background within seconds of the listing photo loading on his screen. The same proportions, the same cornice work, the same single tall structure standing where a studio wall should have been. He won the plate for less than the price of a used camera. When the lens was eventually removed and examined, it carried the same faint maker's mark ground into the corner of the glass that every other camera in this story has carried. Nobody at the auction house had any idea what they'd sold. The consigning family had owned the piece for 3 generations and had always assumed, when they thought about it at all, that it was simply a flaw in an old photograph, the same explanation the Philadelphia dealer reached for the very first time, more than 150 years earlier, before he learned better. Wherever that lens grinder's remaining stock went after 1858, it's still out there. Still occasionally turning up in an attic, a storage unit, an estate sale nobody thought was worth cataloging carefully. Still doing, apparently, exactly what it did the first time it was ever pointed at a person and left open to the light for the better part of a minute. Once, unpredictably, and then never again. So where does that leave us? A single lens-grinding workshop, active for less than a decade, then gone without a trace, its owner unaccounted for in any surviving record, its very lot cycling through unexplained owners even before he arrived. A cluster of cameras built from its hand-ground lenses, scattered across studios in 3 states through the ordinary churn of a second-hand market that neither the dealer nor his customers had any control over. 41 plates, and counting, taken by dozens of different photographers, of sitters who had nothing in common except the specific camera standing in front of them at the moment the shutter opened, and in everyone the same structure appearing exactly once, never repeating, standing in the exact spot where the room's actual wall should have been. Nobody has ever produced a satisfying account of how a stationary object could appear in a single exposure this way without appearing in every subsequent exposure from the same lens. Nobody has ever identified the building itself in any surviving city record, any architectural pattern book, any photograph taken by ordinary means. And nobody, not the dealer, not the second dealer who wrote back, not the modern conservators who studied the silver under ultraviolet light, not the collectors who eventually pieced the story together over a century later, has ever found out what happened to the man who ground the glass. What we're left with is the box, 41 plates, still sealed under their original glass covers in most cases, still showing, if you look closely enough, in the deep background, behind the stiff-collared men and the seated brides and the children too young to hold still for a full minute without blurring, the same tall, ornate, unidentifiable building, standing exactly where nothing should have been standing at all, waiting, in silver and mercury vapor, for someone to finally explain it. And somewhere, in an attic or an estate box nobody's opened yet, there may be a 42nd,